Hi, this is Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop, and welcome back for some more MixCon. In today's mix walkthrough, we've got a special treat. The producer, engineer, mixer, Nic Hard is going to be taking us under the hood of a real commercial release for a Grammy-winning artist, Snarky Puppy. This is actually a revisiting and a remix of one of their earlier albums where they're improving both the stereo mix and surround Atmos mix for this project. Really excited to hear what Nic does with this one. This one is free to the public thanks to our friends over at SonarWorks, and Nic is a big fan of SonarWorks. He uses their solutions to correct both his speakers and his headphones so he can be confident of what they're telling him so he can make his best mixing decisions. He'll tell us a little bit about them and a whole lot about his process and approach when it comes to mixing. If you want to learn more about SonarWorks, just go over to sonarworks.com and check out Sound ID Reference, which is the tool that Nic uses to improve his monitoring situation. If you want to ask questions of Nic, you can. If you're here for the live premiere, just type in any questions that come into your head into the chat box you'll see on your screen as the presentation goes along, and we'll be saving the best ones for a live Q&A that we're going to be doing with Nic right after this main presentation concludes. We've also got more MixCon coming at you, so go over to mix-con.com where you can RSVP for upcoming MixCon masterclasses to make sure you don't miss the live premieres of any of those. And while you're there, we've also got the MixCon Mega Giveaway going. We are giving away thousands upon thousands of dollars worth of free gear with 3 chances to win, so good luck to you. Big thanks to Nic Hard for doing this mix walkthrough for us. Big thanks to Snarky Puppy for letting us go under the hood of their track. And big thanks to SonarWorks for making this one free to the public. Without any further ado from me, let's get right into it. Nic, take it away.
Hi, I'm Nic Hard, a mixing engineer. I'm here at my home studio in Spain for MixCon 2023 with Sonic Scoop. Today, we're going to take a look at a track by Snarky Puppy off their album Silva. Before we do that, I just want to give a quick rundown of the gear that I'm using. I'm mixing entirely within the box. So I just have a MacBook Pro M1, I have an Avid S1, I have Adam Audio S3XHs as my main stereo pair, and then I have Adam Audio A7s as surrounds, and then I'm using this merging Anubis interface. The reason I'm using this interface, it allows me to run my SonarWorks Sound ID reference calibration directly within the interface, so I don't have to worry about running it as a plugin or anything like that. It also does the calibration for the stereo as well as for the Dolby Atmos, as well as running a calibration for my headphones. So we're going to take a look at a track called The Curtain of Snarky Puppy's 2015 release of an album called Silva. It was originally mixed by somebody else, and earlier this year the band decided they wanted to mix it again so they could improve the sound, but also so they could mix in Dolby Atmos. The first thing that I need to look at is I need to look at the original mix and kind of establish how it can be improved and what I can make better about it. The only instruction that I was given was basically keep the same vibe, but make it better. So let's take a listen and let me see if I can identify some things that can help improve the mix. So this is the original mix. I'm just going to take a quick listen. I might skip through a little bit because the song is 15.5 minutes long, and just for the sake of this video, I'm going to try to keep it short. Cool. So one of the things that I'm kind of noticing right away when the band comes in is there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of low end. And there seems to be like a really dense area in the mid-range, especially with the drums and the bass. It feels like everything's kind of like crammed into higher low mids. So that's definitely something I'll kind of look at, is like widening the spectrum and seeing if I can get, you know, more low end out of the bass and the kick drum and things like that. Let's keep listening. Cool. So in this section, same kind of thing in terms of like the low end and the low mid, but I'm also hearing this kind of a messiness that's going on. So I'm gonna have to kind of figure out where that's coming from. So I just feel like there's kind of this like haze thing that's happening. So I'm gonna try to look at like cleaning that up so you can kind of hear the individual elements a little bit more. And also it feels a little flat in terms of the high end. So another thing that I'm noticing seems to be a little bit of size missing, or like grandioseness missing. It feels a little small in places. This is a band with an orchestra, so to me it should be kind of like big and grandiose and have this like really kind of like a huge vibe, but it feels a little flat and a little tame. So I'm gonna take a look at the amount of reverb and stuff like that and see if I can kind of get it to feel a bit more massive. So now let's look at the final mix where I ended up versus the original mix. To do this, I'm going to use metric AB and just kind of flip back and forth. So the new mix is blue and the old mix is yellow. Cool. So hopefully you guys can see the kind of the difference between those two approaches. You know, neither is wrong, and one's not good or bad, but the kind of the things that I set out to get was that richer low end, and as well as this sort of like more sense of grandioseness and you know, a bigger space, especially for the orchestral instruments, and generally just to have it a little less nasal and pinched. So let's take a look at some of the things that I did that got us there. Cool. So the first thing we'll look at is the drums. In the original mix, I found them very like punchy in the mid range and kind of lacking in low end a little bit. And so I kind of want to identify where that's coming from, and also like have less of that mid range so there's more room for other stuff to happen. One of the things I need to consider with all of the instruments on this song is how much bleed there is. This is really important for that sort of like messiness that I was talking about before. So any opportunity I have, I want to kind of shave off any open mic and trim everything back. So in the drum set, I've done it to the toms and to the snares. This drum kit has 2 snares and four toms. So the first thing I do is go through and edit out any time the toms aren't being played. In this song, it's fairly a lot. It looks like this. I tend to do this by hand. I don't use strip silence for this, and I'll put in batch fades, but I'll do it with a nice long fade so that you don't hear the cymbal ring disappear abruptly in the mix. So in addition to the 4 toms, I've also trimmed all the excess off of the snare mics. On this song, he has 2 snare drums. One is for one section of the song is treated like a 5th tom, and then at some point in the song he turns on the snares and it's a second snare drum. So there are 2 snare sounds to deal with and 5 toms basically. So I've gone and trimmed all of that stuff so it's nice and tidy and looks like this. On this, it's not just like the ringing of the toms, but you can kind of hear the rest of the band because if it's live, everybody's in the same room, you have an entire orchestra. So getting rid of that will just make the actual instruments clearer if there isn't bleed coming through these mics. I know it seems like it's not hugely significant, but it all kind of like adds up. In some cases, I would even do the same with a kick. The next thing I want to deal with is the kick drum sound. So I'll quickly check out what was recorded, which was a kick in mic, a kick out mic, and a kick sub mic. Here's the kick in. Here's the sub. And here's the out. All of these mics to me have kind of the same thing happening, which is that they're all kind of like mid-rangey and slappy. Even the kick sub isn't particularly subby. When I was mixing this, I kind of played around with EQ and other things, and I couldn't really get the result that I wanted, so I decided that I would trigger. The way that I do this is with slate trigger, and I'll generate a MIDI trigger, and then I'll use contact. So if you see here, on this track here, I have an instance of contact, and I'm triggering this kick drum. With this kind of music, it's really important that it doesn't sound artificial and that it's mimicking the drummer's intensity and playing like perfectly. So I went through almost section by section and made triggers and adapted the velocity so that it really followed the contour of his playing. So for example, in this section, it's super quiet. This is one of the reasons that I use contact, is because it's not the same sample triggering over and over again. It's multi-layered samples, so that the sample that's being triggered when it's a low velocity is a softer sounding kick drum as it is in real life. So when he gets more intense, the kick drum sound changes. Let's take a listen to the drum kit in solo. I'll add and take away the original mic along with the trigger. In this case, I decided to go with just the sample because it's more open, it has more low end, and it is missing that mid-range slappiness that I'm trying to get rid of. So as far as EQ and compression, the sound that's within Kontakt is pretty good. So I'm doing a little bit of compression, and this is just to sort of compensate for how the big dynamics in the velocities and stuff. You know, it's not a huge amount. It's just a couple dB here and there. And then as far as EQ, I'm just carving out a little bit of the low mids and giving a little boost to the high mids. So let's take a look at the first snare drum. From section to section, he's changing between snare and side stick. So what I've done is I've separated it out so that the snare is on one track, and when he's playing side stick, it's on a second one. And so the EQs are kind of different. So when he's playing the snare, I have this EQ on, and the low mid band is made dynamic so that when he hits the drum, you're getting a little punch in the low mids. I'm doing this because I don't want to just add low mid to the whole track, because that means any of the bleed that's coming through on that mic would also like have more low end. So this way, it's just when he hits the snare drum, we get just like a little push of that low end. You'll notice I'm also cutting some mids and some of the low mids as well, or the higher low mids. This is, again, as you know, listening to the original, I felt like there was too much information happening in that mid range. So I'm looking for places where I can kind of cut that out. And one place where we can do that is in the drum set, because a lot of the other instrumentation needs that space, because we've got an entire orchestra as well as guitars and horns and all kinds of stuff. So I kind of want to reserve that mid-range area for those instruments rather than for the drum set. When the drummer is playing the side stick, I have this EQ happening. So you see is very different, taking off a lot of top end and a lot of low end, and really just focusing on that mid-range of the, you know, the wood sound on the edge of the snare. So you see in solo it doesn't sound particularly good, but in context of the rest of the drums, I'm pushing the frequencies that allows it to pop out of the mix a little bit. Now we get to a chorus. I guess I wasn't quite getting enough excitement from the snare, so I decided to add a sample in underneath. I did this in the same way that I did the kick drum. I used slate trigger, and then I've made a MIDI track from it, and I'm triggering Kontakt. Ordinarily, I would try to find a sample that suits the song. But in this instance, I really just want a snare that kind of sounds like his original, but just a little bit better, because I'm not looking to change the vibe or anything here. I'm just trying to sort of improve the thing. And so one of the things I'm missing in the original snare is a little bit of like top end and crispiness. So I've sort of gone through my sample libraries, and I found one that I think is relatively similar and just adds those few things that I'm kind of missing. The next part of the snare is the bottom mic. A lot of the times I really like this because it adds some of that crispiness that's missing from the top snare mic. Again, super simple. So I've trimmed it out when he's not playing it. I've also trimmed it out when he's playing the side stick, because you don't need it then. So it's only when he's hitting the snare drum that I'm using the bottom mic. This is the EQ that's on it. So sort of similar to the top, I'm cutting out the mid range. You'll see here I have two bands that are actually dynamic. The same one in the low mid, where I've actually found the frequency of the drum itself, so it's boosting that frequency, and then the top as well. And this is just to add, again, crispiness just when he's hitting the snare and not when he's not. So you see a very minor bit of compression. This is probably just, will really only be catching it when he's really hitting it hard. So the last thing on the snare bottom mic is this neutron transient designer. I like this because it's less artificial than gating, but it allows me to kind of control the information in between the snare hits, and this makes it more rhythmic and kind of opens up a little bit more space for things to happen in between the snare hits. Next we have the second snare drum. So as I mentioned before, in different sections of the song, he's using it differently. In this section of the song, he's using it as a tom. So he's taking the snares off. So you'll see I have this really kind of like ugly EQ on it, and in solo it doesn't sound very good. That's because this is sort of made to go in conjunction with the overheads. And so I've taken off the top end because I don't want to hear the cymbal bleed that's on this tom mic disappearing. I've also cut out a lot of the mid-range, and I just have boosted that low mid. Yeah, again, in solo it's not particularly pretty, but in context of the rest of the drum mics, it works. And then later in the song, on the same snare mic, he puts the snares back on, and it's a deep snare. So here's top and bottom. And so on the snare top mic, I have more or less that same EQ, probably carving out a little more of that higher low mid. And on this one, the high band is also made dynamic, so that when he's hitting the snare, it gets a little bit brighter. And a very similar EQ for the bottom mic. In this section of the song as well, I decided to add another layer of sample. So I've gone through, same process, slate, trigger, made a MIDI track, and then using Contact again. This time it's a different sample. It's one that's another deep snare. I found one that's kind of similar to the original. Again, I'm not looking to radically change anything. I just kind of want to reinforce what was there. And this also allows me to EQ in a little bit of brightness without bringing up things like the hi-hat or the cymbals and things like that. I'll play a little bit of this section and I'll mute and unmute the track so you can kind of hear what the sample is adding to it. So this is with and without. So you see it sounds quite a lot larger with the sample in. This is partially because of the way that it's treated, and also because I've added a reverb to just the trigger. Cool, so for the hi-hat, it's just one track for the whole song. Again, super simple on the processing, really not a lot happening. I'm just doing this low cut. Again, that's just, I don't really want kick drum or any low frequency stuff in addition to the stuff that's already in there. So next we have the tom mics. Again, super simple processing, just an EQ. In fact, it's the same EQ on all of them. And you'll see that the low shelf is actually quite wide. This is to catch the different fundamentals of the toms. I could go in and be more specific about the fundamental frequency of the tom, but this low shelf kind of catches it all for each of the different toms. I'm also sending the toms to the same reverb as our snare trigger. Next, we have the overheads. On this EQ, I basically have a low cut, really steep, and I'm basically just trying to get rid of anything below that. Again, I'm not really trying to be gentle with it, because I don't want any of that information in there. So I have a distressor on each of the overheads. The purpose of this is not really to change the sound drastically, but basically just to sort of control and push back the snare drum in the overheads. Then we have the reverb that's on the snare and the toms. This happens to be like the default in Altiverb, but it's suited. I probably went through and looked at a few different ones, but this one just kind of had the right vibe. So all of these tracks are a bus to a drum bus. Let's take a look at the processing that's on there. The first thing is this back EQ. So I'm controlling basically a little bit of the low end, and I'm cutting off everything above 18K. The next thing I have on the drum bus is this BX Townhouse bus compressor. I've found it kind of works well for drums. I've got an attack of 10, super fast release, and just, 2-to-1 ratio. Next is this drum strip from SSL. The parts of this that I'm using in this song is the low frequency enhance. This is again to like add in more of that low frequency that I was missing from the original mix. Let me just show you what it's like with and without that. So this is with. Without. Cool, so it's just giving like a nice little goose at 63 Hertz. The other component of the drum strip that I'm using is the transient shaper. This is basically just to sort of push the kick and the snare a little bit forward in the mix. Next is the Slate Digital virtual tape machine. This just adds a little bit of color. I like the way it brings the mid-range forward. Lastly, I have this API 550A, and you'll see I'm basically just knocking out 2 dB at 400 Hertz. Next in the session are a bunch of percussion tracks. There's a percussionist in the band, and then there's also a percussionist in the orchestra. One of the biggest challenges here is dealing with the bleed. So I've gone through all of the tracks and figured out what's being played, and then tried to figure out which microphone best suits that instrument. So in a lot of cases, I'm not using all of the tracks that were recorded. Yeah, basically just made the decision which mics to use and which not to. So I'll give you an example. I'll play these percussion tracks and solo them, and we can just take a listen and see what's there. Obviously, the one that's labeled Perk Tom has the best Tom information, so I'm definitely going to use that. The one above that that's labeled Perk Toys is cool, but feels a little unfocused. The one above that, Perk Overhead Gong, feels very washy to me, so I'm probably not going to use that one. This one here that's labeled Perk Overhead Cymbal seems to have the best information for all of the different elements, and it feels relatively tight, and I'm not getting a lot of bleed. So I'm going to use the Perk Tom mic and then the Perk Overhead Cymbal mic, and I'm going to mute the other two. Also, there's this other sound on another mic. I'm not sure what it is. I think it's like a brush, a metal brush on something. And you kind of hear it in this track up here, but I want to bring it out a little bit more. So I found it on another track, and then I've edited out everything in between, so I can really focus an EQ on that specific sound. So it sounds like this. So it's pretty harsh editing wise, but when you add the other percussion mics back in, or in context of the mix, it sounds totally normal. A lot of the EQs on the percussion track will be just a lot of low-end control. Probably not doing a whole lot else. Like on this track, yeah, just the low cut, everything below 56. On this tom track down here, it's more like a tom EQ. This looks pretty extreme. Let's take a listen to it without it, actually. I've quite severely cut out like 12 dB of mid-range. This is probably so it fits more with the toms on the drum kit, and again reduces some of that mid-range information that we were kind of trying to slim down originally. So there's a few other percussion tracks, and it's all more or less the same thing. I'm just choosing the mics that kind of work best for the sound. The only other thing that's kind of special is on this orchestral percussion, I'm adding this Shep's up mix. This is basically so that it turns it from a mono signal into a stereo signal and just makes it a little bit grander. So at this moment of the song, it just gets a little bit wider and a little bit bigger than it would be if it was a mono source. So also as part of the orchestral percussion, there's a marimba, and there's a section of the song where it's almost by itself. In the original, I really didn't like how close this felt. It felt very sort of, yeah, really upfront, and I felt like it was kind of out of context in a way. Cool, and so basically for me, I wanted to give it a little bit more personality. So the main way that I'm doing that is by adding a reverb. I've decided to go with this FabFilter Pro R. Nothing super special going on here. 3 seconds of reverb. As far as the EQ, it's pretty severe. So I'm cutting off a lot of low end and also a lot of top. In the original recording, I didn't really like how sort of clicky it was, and I really just want to focus on the tone of the instrument. I'll put the top back in just so you can hear what it was like, but for me, having more of a focus on the body of the instrument rather than the attack of the mallets was sort of more appropriate, and with the reverb it feels sort of further away rather than being up close. You see, it's quite clicky with that top end. I feel like it's better without. Next in the tune, we have the bass. In this song, there's an electric guitar bass and there's also a key bass. On the synth bass, I'm not really doing a whole lot. I'm cutting out a little bit of the low mids, but more or less leaving it as it was. For the guitar bass, there was a DI and there was also a cab. In this instance, I decided to just use the DI and use a reamping software in this case. Again, just to reduce the bleed. If we listen to the bass cab mic, you're going to hear a lot of the other instruments. And if I try to EQ it at all, it's just going to get muddier. So you hear there's quite a lot of other stuff that's coming in that mic. So for me, it's better just to turn it off and then just use the DI and then use an amp simulator to recreate the amp effect. To do this, I'm using the Brainworks SVT plugin. I'm also using the original DI, so it's a blend of the DI and then the amped signal as well. And then everything runs into a bass bus. On the bass bus, there's an LA2A. There's probably not a whole lot of compression happening. After that, I have a little radiator. And then after that, I have this Pro Q3. Later in the tune, there's a bass solo. So I've added an extra EQ and extra compression that get automated on for that section. And this is basically just to allow the bass solo to come forward and step out in front of everything else. The EQ, you can see I'm boosting a lot of mid and high mid. Again, this is just so it's heard. And then I'm also increasing the compression so it allows it to sit on top a little bit. So in this section, you can really hear the difference between the old mix and the new mix. So the next thing is a Rhodes. For this, we have a left and right amp signal. So there is a little bit of bleed. So on the EQ, I've gone pretty hard on the low cut because I don't want to hear any low end from the drums or anything else coming through. And just basically bringing that low cut up to the lowest frequency that you hear in the Rhodes. I've also cut some of the top end off. And so this Rhodes is basically just kind of existing in the mid-range. And this is one of the instruments that we've kind of made that space for in the drums, so the Rhodes can kind of live in that area. After I have the EQ, I have an LA2A. This is just to sort of control the dynamics a little bit. Again, nothing super crazy happening. When I was mixing this, I also noticed they were having some kind of technical issue during the tracking. So there was this kind of like popping and clicking thing that was happening. I don't think it was a digital error, but just something with the instrument itself. I'll play a little bit for you and then I'll show you how I took care of it. So you can kind of see here, it sounds like a mechanical issue with the instrument itself. So to do this, I'll export the files out to Isotope RX. I'll just do a little snippet of it just to show you. So I'll open Isotope RX as a standalone plugin and then use the monitor plugin to listen to what's happening. Within RX, I'll use the spectral repair replace function with the instant process. If I just click instant process down here and then use this selection tool, I can kind of dial in and find the sounds, and then it will replace those parts where there's noise. Okay, so in this little section of the file, we can kind of see those clicks. So all of this very bright information down here is the body of the instrument, and then these little guys here are these clicks. So I'm just gonna highlight just the high frequency part. So you can see it's a lot better. So basically do that for the whole song. Next to the piano tracks. On these, there's definitely a little bit more bleed than I would have liked. So the EQ is a little bit severe, and it isn't like the best sounding piano in solo because of the EQ. But again, it doesn't really matter what it sounds like in solo. It matters more what it's like in context. So I'm really just trying to focus on the important part of the sound and cut away anything extra that's coming in. Cool, so you see that when I bypass the EQ, there's definitely more rumbly stuff happening. Even with the EQ in, there's still a little bit more than I'd like, but I was trying to kind of keep some of the body of the piano or the bottom end of the piano in. I'm also taking off a little bit of top, and that's just for cymbal bleed and things like that. Again, the piano would sound better if that stuff was in, but it's kind of a matter of controlling the bleed and trying to keep the mess down a little bit. Later in the song, there's a solo piano section. So the band isn't in at that point. So what I've done is I've taken the piano tracks and put them on a different set of tracks with a different EQ, and I've also added a reverb. Cool, so you see the EQ here, there's more of the bottom end in. I've left the top alone, and I've just boosted a little bit of high mids just to make it a little bit brighter. So a much more natural sounding thing. And I can do that because it's out in the open and there's not a drummer playing and not a full orchestra playing in the same room. I've used also another instance of Altiverb in the same room that I have the snare going into and the toms, but it's on a different bus. I like to give each instrument its own reverb bus. So on this section, I've added that reverb because I kind of wanted to make it sound a bit more, like we were talking about earlier, a bit more grandiose and have a bit more of this sort of vibe of being kind of bigger. If we take a listen back to the original mix, and we'll A/B and just see the difference between with and without the reverb. Cool. So the in the original mix, it was much drier and much closer, and in my mix, I've added this reverb, and to me, it feels a little bit more emotional. And really, at the end of the day, that's kind of what we're trying to get here. Next, we have a B3. So we've got a left and a right and a low mic. Again, any time he's not playing, this has been trimmed out. I don't want open mics kind of hanging out. And again, I'm keeping kind of the processing super simple. In fact, it's just low cuts on the mics. Relatively aggressive, relatively steep, slightly different on the low. I would have looked for the lowest frequency that he plays and just brought it up to there. I'm not looking to change the sound. I'm basically just looking to get rid of anything that's superfluous. On the B3 bus, I have a distressor. Let's see what that's up to. So there's really not a lot going on there. I'm basically just looking to bring the louder parts down a couple of dB. Next is the clavinet. This was recorded just DI, which is good because it means there isn't another open mic to deal with, but it's bad because I kind of miss the sound of an amped clavinet. So what I've done is I've added a Fender Deluxe amp simulation. After the amp simulator, I've added a compressor pedal, which is pretty aggressive. And I've done this because on the clav, there's a wah pedal. And so when he's at the bottom of the sweep of the wah, it's a lot quieter than at the top. So this way, it kind of makes it more even, and you can kind of hear the full sweep of the wah pedal. So that's really like leveling the whole thing out. After that, I have a stereo delay. And the purpose of this delay is basically to take the mono clav and make it stereo. So on one side of the delay, I have 0 milliseconds, and on the other side, I have 20 milliseconds. And all this does is just take it out of the middle and puts it in the left and the right. And a lot of the times when I do this, if it's an instrument with some low-end information, you kind of lose a little bit of that. But in this context, I feel like it's worth it because it gives you the space in the middle. If we go back and listen to the original mix, you actually don't hear the clav very well. So by panning it left and right and making it stereo, it kind of brings it out and allows us to hear it along with the bass synths. After the clav, we have a bass synth. I decided to do the same faux stereo effect on this, so it has the stereo delay, 0 milliseconds on one side, 20 on the other. Again, this just takes it out of the middle, which creates more space. I really want to make sure that I'm using the stereo field to my advantage here, because we have so much instrumentation and so much information to get across that having everything stacked up in the middle we're just going to be like banging our heads against the wall the whole day. Also on the bass synth, I'm boosting 9 dB at 12K. I want to hear the buzz kind of sticking out above the mix, as well as the bass of the instrument. Also on the track that had the bass synth is Corey Henry's solo. So what I've done is I've pulled this down onto a different track so I can affect it differently. So on the solo, I still have the same boost at 12K. I'm ducking a little bit down in the low mids. I have this compressor on, again, because I want to hear like every single note that he plays. This particular compressor is super aggressive. It's definitely not gentle, and it's not subtle. And then after that, I'm actually adding a little bit of gain, a little bit of distortion with a little radiator. You'll see that the bias switches on, which makes it a little like fuzzier. For the solo, I've added a delay. I've used the Soundtoys Echo Boy. It looks pretty much like the stock setting when you open it up, except that I've added a little bit of low cut. In addition, leading into the solo section, I've kind of created this delay throw effect that happens. So I've automated some of the parameters within the Echo Boy. Next, we have another bass synth. I've also opted to kind of do a stereo effect. This time, I've decided to use the Dimension D emulator. Again, this is to kind of get it out of the middle and leave space for the bass. So there's yet another bass synth. I wanted to make this one stereo as well. This time I used the Dimension D emulator. And the reason I did this is, again, to get it out of the middle, because we have the bass guitar playing this part and we have two bass synths that play this part. And then we also have the clav, which is playing a similar part. So what I've done is basically put all of these keyboards in the left and the right so that there's space for the bass guitar in the middle so we can hear it. And later in this section is where the bass solo happens. So basically I'm opening up the middle so that the bass guitar can kind of be featured. In this band, there are three guitarists. So I've panned Bob Lanzetti to the left, Chris McQueen to the right, and on Mark Lettieri, I've actually made him stereo, again with that faux stereo delay. As far as EQ, relatively simple. Again, just trying to control the low end first, then adding a little bit of compression, and after the compression, doing a little bit more EQ, and that's just to kind of like stylize the sound once it's under control. So you'll see on Bob here, I'm just cutting a little bit of 220 on down. On Mark, you'll see it's a little different. I'm adding a bit of 10K and a little bit of 4.8 and leaving the bottom end alone. And on Chris, same thing, just 220 on down, just losing a little bit of that. So the processing on the guitars is relatively simple. There's not a whole lot going on. It's mostly those panning choices that kind of count here. Finally, before going to the orchestra, we'll talk about the horn section that's in Snarky Puppy. So in this song, there are two trumpets, a saxophone, and the saxophonist also plays bass clarinet later in the song. With the horn mics, there's a lot of bleed on these, so I'm cutting the low end a little bit, but there's really not too much I can do with it, so I kind of have to live with it. In addition to this little bit of EQ, using Soothe. And this is just to tame some of the frequencies that kind of build up. So it'll adapt to whatever frequency is sticking out and push it back a little bit. This makes them sound a little bit softer and less abrasive. You'll see here that on Jay's trumpet track, I have this extra EQ. This is automated on for his solo. So during his solo, I just want it to be a little bit brighter. So I've boosted here actually quite a lot of the top end. So for the snarky horn section, I've added reverb. Again, I've used Altiverb. It's the same Teldex patch. The purpose of adding reverb to these horns is also to like set them back in the mix a little bit, so they're not completely right up front and dry and kind of impersonal. So this makes it sound, you know, like they're in a space. Okay, so now we get into the orchestral elements. A lot of tracks here and a lot of things to kind of go through. Generally, overall, the processing is pretty light. The main purpose is really just, I'm just trying to control the bleed as best I can. So again, the EQ is relatively severe. I'm cutting off a lot of the low frequency and I'm cutting off top frequency. There's a lot of bleed on these tracks and I really just want to focus on the fundamental of the notes that are being played. So you can see there's a lot of stuff going on down below that all that's going to do is just sort of create mud and take up space that could be taken up by the instrument itself. After the flutes, we have a section of clarinets. There are 3 clarinets and 2 bass clarinets. You'll see here that I've actually muted one of them. This was because the track, it sounded like the microphone wasn't even really on the instrument. So it really served no purpose. So rather than leaving it in and adding to the noise, I just made the decision to turn it off. You can still hear the other clarinet in one of the other microphones because they're all standing right next to each other. But yeah, I had to kind of make the decision to cut this track. As far as EQ goes, same kind of thing. Really just trying to take care of that low end stuff and the high end bleed situation. With the bass clarinets, I've cut off a little bit more of the top end because you have this sort of buzzy thing, which in some songs I would want to leave on, but in this context, because it's orchestral, I want to take it off. The clarinets and the flutes share reverb. I elected not to put the bass clarinets in there because I didn't want to kind of add more mud to the thing. And in this instance, I decided to use the FabFilter Pro R. I did this because I feel like it's a bit more transparent and it has, in the way I have it set, is a little bit less character. Therefore, it doesn't occupy as much space in the mix, but still gives kind of the size and the vibe. Next, we have the horn section for the Metropole. In there are 2 French horns, a tuba, 3 trombones, and a bass trombone. I've treated these relatively similar to the way I've treated the Snarky horns, in that I've just used a little bit of EQ and the soothe on every channel. These also have their own reverb. So on the Metropole horns, I have yet another instance of altiverb, and it's the same setting again. So all of the Metropole horns and the reverb are sent to a bus, and on that bus I have the virtual tape machine. For the most part, it's just adding a little bit of mid-range, but in this section here, it's actually going into the red and adding a decent amount of saturation as well. And this, I think, just sort of adds an aggressive edge to it that kind of suits the section of the song. So next we have the string section for the Metropole. So there's a bunch of violins, violas, cellos, and basses. I did notice when I was kind of looking through the tracks that there's duplicates of some of them. And basically there were overhead mics, and then there were also clip-on mics. Generally the overhead mics sound better. The clip-on mics are, not as good, but they have less bleed. So on some of the songs, not as much in this one, but on some of the songs, I opted just to use the clip-on mics, except for the sections where the strings were by themselves, because the amount of drum bleed that gets added from those overhead mics is pretty significant, and it changes the drum sound quite a lot. So it's less to do with the sound of the strings and more to do with the sound of the drums. The EQ on the strings is also relatively simple. Not doing a whole hell of a lot, just cutting the low end and shaving off a little bit of the top end. In this song, I've decided just to use the clip-on mics for the violas and the cellos, and not to use the overheads. So also on each of these close mics, I've also added a reverb. Ordinarily, with an orchestra and a string section, it's really nice to have a decatry or a big wide sound that's kind of far away. This isn't really possible in this situation because you've got a drum set in the room. So with the reverb here, I'm kind of trying to recreate that effect of the strings not being like super up close but more like they are in an orchestra hall. So I've sent each of these close mics down to a bus with another instance of Altiverb. This time, I'm finally using a different reverb, this Disney Hall. And you'll see in the beginning of the song here, I have automated the level of that up. So when the strings are out and exposed by themselves, I have more reverb happening. And then when the band enters, I'm bringing it back. And that's basically because once the band enters, that reverb isn't really heard, and it's more just sort of creating a little bit more mess. But so out front in the intro, I really want to have more of that big like orchestra hall kind of vibe. So again, if we A/B with the original mix, to me, having this reverb on the strings is kind of is adding a little bit of emotion to the thing. And also in the original mix, the strings are kind of brighter. And I've actually sort of purposefully withheld a little bit of the top end. One, for the bleed situation, and two, just to make them a little bit more like you're listening from a distance. And so it's not like they're right in front of you, but that you're sitting back in the concert hall as you kind of would listen to an orchestra. The last set of tracks in the session is audience mics or ambient mics. I kind of have no idea where these were placed in the venue, but I listened through some. There were a couple of tracks that were labeled 119 and 120. I didn't know what they were, but I felt like they had good audience on them. And so there's a section in the song where there's some applause. So I wanted to make sure they were on there. After Corey's solo, the audience applauds. So I wanted to make sure that really comes out. And also at the end of the song. Then we get to the mix bus. I tend to do a decent amount of processing on the mix bus, and usually I'll do that after I've gotten the EQs and balances for everything else. Then I'll add the plugins to the mix bus, and then I'll go back and do the automation. But on my mix bus, I have an instance of this dangerous backs EQ. Nothing too crazy, just the super low end being cut and the super top end being cut. Then I have an instance of the SSL bus compressor. Again, super light compression. I'm probably never seeing more than 4 dB of gain reduction. I have an instance of the virtual tape machine. Same thing here. This is probably not being used in the same way it was being used on the horns. This is probably gentle and not really getting much saturation, but it's just bringing a little bit of presence. Then I have an instance of Gullfoss. To me, really, the main thing it's doing, it's actually adding a little bit of clarity. So it's brightening things up. It's a pretty deep plugin in terms of what it's doing, and I don't know that I fully understand everything that it's doing, other than I like the way it sounds. Next, I have Oxford Inflator and the Brainworks True Peak Limiter. The Oxford Inflator is, to me, it just adds a little bit of girth to the thing. And then the limiter, I'm just using it to bring the level up to the level of the master of the original. So basically, a lot of the stuff I'm doing in this mix is really just about controlling the bleed and just allowing instruments to be heard and really sort of positioning things so that you can hear all of the different layers. And that's really the challenge with stuff that's this dense. So if I push harder into the realm of adding effects and things like that, it can create like more muddiness. Where normally I'd kind of, push that stuff a little harder. In this context, really the goal is to create space and allow you to hear everything that's going on. So that's, keeping it relatively light on the processing. I think helps deal with that. Okay, so that was the basic stereo mix. Obviously, there was a lot more that we didn't cover as it's a 15.5-minute song. But I want to take a little bit of time and talk about the Atmos version of the mix as well, and how I adapted the stereo mix into Atmos. The audio that you're going to be hearing is the binaural render. So hopefully you'll get some of the effects, and I'll when I do some of the panning stuff, you'll kind of hear it. I'll start with the session that we just were working on, kind of pick up where we left off. When I'm doing an Atmos mix, I love having the original session and working from that rather than working from stems. And I'll show you why. There's a couple of things that I like to do. And I feel like it allows me to take more advantage of the fun spatial elements. The first thing I'll do is import my mix bus and object bed tracks, which I have in a template, and they have all of the routing and busing information that I'll need to get started. So here's my surround mix bus. It's a 7.0.4 bus, and then beneath it I have an LFE bus. You'll see that the plugins that are on these buses are copies of what was on my stereo bus. And I do this because I want the sound to be more or less the same, so I'm going to use the same processing chains. The only exception is the virtual tape machine, which doesn't have a multi-channel version yet, so I can't do that. Below those tracks, you'll see I have a copy of the stereo master. I have that there because I basically want to be able to A/B between the Atmos mix and the stereo mix. I want to make sure that the vibe doesn't change too drastically. Because I'm working from the full mix session and I did it, I stand kind of like a better chance of doing that than if I was working from stereo stems that somebody else had mixed. So because I have the original session here and all of the plugins, it's kind of easy to get to a similar place, but I still want to be able to check it. So the first thing I'm going to do is go back to the beginning and address the drums. And again, I'm not looking to like reinvent anything here. I'm just looking to place things in the spatial audio field. So to do that, I'm going to select all of my drum tracks that were in the stereo bus folder, and I'm going to assign them to a new folder, but instead of being a stereo bus, it's going to be a 7.0.4 bus. This is also including the reverb. So now I'm just going to copy the plugins that were on the stereo bus down to the surround bus. Again, I kind of have to skip the virtual tape machine because it doesn't do multi-channel yet. So if I hit play, it's going to sound more or less like it did just in the stereo version because I haven't pushed anything out yet. So one of the first things that I'm going to do is just add a little bit of kick drum to the LFE send, so that we get a bit of extra bottom out of it. The next thing that I like to do is pan the toms around a little bit. Normally we have the toms going from left to right or right to left, and here I want to make that a little bit whiter. I kind of want to put the listener almost in the drummer's position. So I'm gonna have the toms wrap around, and we also have 4 or 5 of them, so we can kind of really take advantage of this opportunity. So I'm going to take this first rack tom, and I'm going to pan it not just all the way to the left, but I'm going to take it all the way to the side on the left. And then the second tom, I'm going to leave that, in the front corner, in the front left corner. This next tom I'm going to leave in the front right corner. And then this fourth one, I'm going to put it all the way opposite the first one. So now these are going to wrap around. So the next thing that I like to do with the drum kit is to add a bit of height to the overheads and put them in the front left and right. Also for the drums, I want to take the reverb that we had, which was this instance of altiverb. So right now, it's still just stereo, so that's just going to be firing in the front, left, and right speaker. So what I want to do is basically use the same thing. I don't want to change the reverb, but I want it to be a surround reverb. So the easiest way I found to do this is with a plugin called Halo. And this is going to take that reverb information and basically spread it all around, including the height channels as well. Let's listen to just the solo of the reverb. This is the stereo without the halo. And that's with a halo. So it's spreading information around. I hope you guys can hear that. So now I'll open up the actual Atmos mix session and we can take a look at some of the other bussing and panning choices. So with a lot of these things, I'm not changing much in the way of EQ. I'm keeping what we had from the stereo mix. And I'm literally just sort of adapting it to a surround bus and then panning things out. So let's take a look at some of this percussion stuff, and we'll just look at the panning. So here I'm utilizing putting something a little bit further back where it was somewhere else in the original. On this track, I decided to add an instance of halo. So let's take a listen to that with and without. It looks like I decided to take these percussion elements and give them a little bit of height and put them directly overhead. So again, it's really, at this point, it's really just about panning and creating a spatial sensation. So with the bass, I decided not to turn it into a 704 bus because I didn't really feel like I wanted anything in the heights or anything really behind me. But what I did do was basically take this sort of stereo bass, which was in left and right, and bring it in a little bit, so that instead of it being sort of pinned against the front two speakers, it does exist a little bit further out. And this increases the volume, makes the bass a bit more present, but does also, in a way, make use of some of the spatial audio. Also on the bass bus, I've added a little bit of send to the LFE. So basically now in the LFE, we have the kick drum and this bass guitar and bass synth. Now we get into the keyboards. It looks like I've left the Rhodes more or less the same. And then with the piano, I've taken it out a little bit wider. So it comes back into these side surrounds a little bit. And then for the solo section, I've put it back. So actually it gets less wide for when the piano is by itself. And that's kind of to keep it more realistic and sort of to bring your focus in, so that when the rest of the band comes back in, it kind of explodes out a little bit again. So kind of narrowing the spatial audio sensation so that there can be this kind of like release later. Now we get down to the clav, and I've left it with the stereo delay on it. And what I've done is basically just pan it even wider than it was in stereo. So it as well is going further out to the left and the right. So for me right now, the clav is all the way out here, sort of matching where the toms are. This bass synth I've left exactly as it was in the stereo mix. So with the stereo delay, so it's just in the left and the right. It's kind of funny how small it sounds now in comparison to the stuff that's been panned even wider. In Corey's solo, I've taken it in the center, but I've decided to give it a little bit of height. And this sort of takes your attention up a little bit, and sort of really features the soloist. So across this record, anytime somebody takes a solo, or most of the time somebody takes a solo, I'll add a little bit of height to it. And this to me just like helps it stand out a little bit. As for the delay that was on the solo, I've just added an instance of the Nugent Halo, and this just gives it a little bit wider of an effect. For the next synth that was on there, the one that I added the chorus to, that stayed exactly the same as it did in the stereo mix, so just left and right with a stereo chorus effect. So now the guitars. The guitars that were left and right are now extreme left and right, so all the way out in the side surrounds. And the one that was stereo with our stereo delay again, that is just normal left and right. So this is one of the things I really love about Atmos, is just how much separation you can get. Now, instead of the guitars kind of being piled on top of each other, even though they were panned like hard left and right in the stereo mix, they were still kind of occupying similar spaces. Now, you really feel each of the three guys in like a completely different place. So for the Snarky horn section, I've changed the stereo bus to a 7.0.4 bus. This is basically so that I can add the halo to the reverb that's on them and make it a spatial reverb. I've left the panning more or less the same except for a couple instances. One of those being on Jay's trumpet solo. So I did the same thing that I did with Corey's solo. I just added a little bit of height. So he's in the center channel, but just a little bit above the listener. I kind of feel like this helps give a little bit of focus. So now we get back into the orchestral world. And for this, you know, part of me was thinking that I should keep it like super realistic, but then another part of me was like, well, fuck it, why don't I just make the most of the spatial audio thing and pan things where I like. So I went that route. So I did things like this, where I'm basically, again, using some of the height. This is, again, for sort of separation and really just to give this sort of sensation of things being all around you. You know, I figure it's better to go this way than to be super safe, and yeah, we might as well make the most out of it. So the flutes are kind of panned as they were in the stereo mix, but with the added height. Bass clarinets I've put left and right. I can't remember how they were in the stereo mix, but they are left and right here. With the clarinets, again, I've added height, and these ones I've even put extra wide. So I brought them back a little bit. And once again, I've just used the same reverb that was on them, the same bus, and I've just added an instance of halo. Again, just to sort of take the stereo reverb and make it a spatial audio one. Now we get to the Metropole horn section. Same kind of thing. All I'm really changing here is just the panning and the placement. So if we have a look, we've got French horns, which are now, French horns are starting to get like behind us a little bit. So it's at minus 25, and so I have them left and right, and starting to kind of reach around for the back. Next is tuba. I guess whatever mood I was in that day, I felt like the tuba should be behind me. And then for the trombones, I kind of have them on the right, but again, they're kind of like wrapping around and going wider than they would in the stereo, except for the bass bone, which is over in the left speaker. Now we get to the string section. Again, same thing. I'm really only just changing panning. I've turned the string bus into a 704 string bus, and I'm basically, yeah, giving a little bit of height to the violins. I'm also panning them wider than I would have done in the stereo. Cellos I've kind of left at ground level. And then for the basses, I've panned them all to the back. So they're kind of stereo, but behind you. The only thing left is the audience mics, which there were a bunch, so I took the opportunity and panned them around a little bit. So the first four, I panned one to the front left, one to the front right, one to the rear left, and one to the rear right. And then the last two tracks, I used an instance of halo on each one. So this should hopefully create a nice surround audience. Let's check it out. In addition to the panning on those ambient mics, I've also added an additional reverb. And this is just for the Atmos, so this wasn't reflected in the stereo. And this reverb is a quad reverb, and it goes just to the heights. So only into the 4 speakers that are above me. Cool. So that's the basis for the Atmos mix. Next in the process is kind of A-Bing with the stereo master and just making sure that it represents exactly the same thing. Again, because I'm starting from the point of the stereo mix, it's going to be relatively close. I just need to try to match a little bit of EQ, similar to what the mastering engineer did. In this case, it's pretty close. I'll do a little A-B for you between the surround mix and the stereo. To me, I really love the way that this album and this song sounds in Atmos. I think this kind of a song with this much instrumentation in it and the orchestral elements really benefit from the extra space and the sensation of music happening behind you and all around you. I actually way prefer it to the stereo mix. You know, I know everybody can't listen with a full setup, but hopefully the binaural render is doing a good job and you guys are kind of getting a sense of the space in the spatial audio. So I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you around.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that mixing masterclass and walkthrough from Nic Hard. So great to get under the hood of a Snarky Puppy track. Tremendous artist and some tremendous playing. Big thanks again also to SonarWorks for making this one free to the public. Check out Sound ID Reference if you haven't already. It will dramatically improve the sound and, more importantly, the accuracy of your monitors and headphones so you can make more confident mixing decisions without second-guessing yourself. If you've got questions for Nic, remember that we have a live Q&A coming up right after this main masterclass concludes. And we've got a whole bunch more MixCon masterclasses and workshops coming up, so make sure you go to mix-con.com to RSVP for upcoming MixCon premieres. While you're there, remember that we've got the MixCon Mega Giveaway going, where we are giving away thousands upon thousands of dollars worth of free gear with 3 chances to win. So good luck to you, and I hope to see you in the live Q&A. See you there.